So this paper about drugs, sex and queer spaces is also in a timely way, I think, given the recent 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, New York, a couple of years ago, about the before and after of a police raid. Police raids, in a way, as literal and symbolic attempts to enforce sexual and gender normativity are often understood as pivotal events in queer history. And even in the UK, the idea of Stonewall and after exerts a powerful hold, not least because Stonewall gave its name to the UK's largest LGBT charity. So today I want to return to two largely unremembered raids on a pub called the Royal Vauxhall Tavern in South London in the late 1980s, in order to think about the sexual ordering of urban space, or alternatively, the spatialisation of the sexual in England and Wales after the so-called Wolfenden Report of 1957, which is famous for leading to, in 1967, 10 years later, the partial decriminalisation of sex between men. A moment that's been seen as a sort of new sexual settlement in post-war British history that established an enlarged zone of sexual privacy beyond the concern of the law, while restricting or attempting to restrict the public visibility of what was still deemed questionable or disreputable sexual cultures. So in the case of the Wolfenden Report and the Sexual Offences Act of 1967, this was primarily to do with homosexual sex and also sex work in general. So in particular, though, I want to think about the role of intoxicants, and in this case, poppers or drugs of the alkyl nitrite family, the role they played in troubling this post-Wolfenden sexual ordering through the increasingly important role they played in materializing a third space between the sexually public and the sexually private, which the Wolfenden Report set up. Which I want to call the space of the queer counter-public, following a formulation of Lauren Ballant and Michael Warner. And then in the second part of the paper, I want to consider how this space of the queer counter-public, which emerged partly as a space of psychoactive or psychotropic experience, of altered consciousness and psychic liberation, became read during the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, which was framed as a crisis of virality or the viral, a problem of broken boundaries, as a space that for some required removal from the face of the city. Okay, so amyl nitrite was first synthesized in the 1840s, but emerged as a treatment for angina in the 1860s, basically as an inhalant able to relax smooth muscles, including those in the blood vessels, and thereby increase blood flow around the body. We can find articles, for example, in the British Medical Journal from the 1870s, describing early research into the effects of alkyl nitrites. The first recreational use of amyl nitrite, apparently, the history is muddy, dates from the 1930s, when medical students started experimenting with it for kicks and the feelings of head rush and giggliness that it could produce. The slang name poppers came from the breaking of the glass ampoules that contain the chemicals that were to be inhaled. The muscle relaxant properties of poppers, as many quickly discovered, also made them useful for sex, including anal sex, while the immediate head rush poppers provided were also seen by some users as a good way to increase the intensity of orgasm. Unlike some other drugs in Britain that moved from the medical to the social realms, poppers survived the 20th century as drugs that were only loosely regulated, available for sale so long as they were advertised as things like room odorizer or audio tape head cleaner, which I think is quite an appropriate label, and not fit for human consumption. Most recently, in 2016, poppers eventually escaped inclusion in a new law, the Psychoactive Substances Act in England and Wales, because they were not deemed to affect the central nervous system directly, but only as a secondary effect of dilation. So this is to say that the legal status of poppers has always been in the UK marked by uncertainty and ambiguity, and the use of alibis in sale and consumption as well. This in part explains aspects of the story I'm going to tell about what happened in the 1980s and why they became subject to policing and sort of illegalization or criminalization in the context of something like AIDS. By the 70s, poppers were being sold openly under brand names like Rush, Liquid Gold, and Hardware in many gay clubs, pubs, and head shops, especially in the queer urban centres of San Francisco, New York, and London, and were increasingly thought of by many as a gay drug. In the words of the Gay News newspaper in the UK in 1973, the gay drug, even though poppers, of course, have never been used exclusively by gay men or for sex. The names of brands of poppers in the UK in the 1970s give some indication of their perceived effects. So Liquid Gold, perhaps in terms of heightening orgasm or adding luster to sex in some way. Rush, for the feelings of head rush and the ability to power all night dancing. And Hardware, perhaps, in terms of its sort of these muscle relaxant properties and their use for easing sex and anal sex, and also queer practices such as fisting. The development of poppers as heart medicine, though, is actually poetic and instructive in a cheesy kind of way, I think. If we think about their popularity among gay men during the years of gay lib, as it prompts us to consider the ways in which drugs were embedded into the forms of feeling and forms of relationality that characterised the moment of gay liberation in the UK, and the shifting landscape of queer urban nightlife in the 70s and early 80s, notably the rise of disco as both a social space or event and a musical form, and later post-disco electronic musics like High Energy, which was really the sound of gay clubs in early to mid-1980s Britain. So poppers circulated at the gay disco, including gay discos like Poppers, a new nightclub in Bristol that opened in 1979. You see the advert for it there on the slide. Through intimate and social practices of sharing and pairing. Poppers contributed to the heady and collective euphoria of the night, matching perfectly with the propulsive, hands-in-the-air energy of High Energy, which established the tempo of many queer dance floors in the 80s. A music that just kept going in an endless stream of sound through the development of two turntable mixing. Poppers, like other later club drugs, were passed around from dancer to dancer, friend to friend, emerging as a cornerstone of queer sociality in certain social spaces. Altered consciousness was not, in this sense, an individual experience, a retreat inwards, but potentially a collective one, a collectively realized change in perception of the world as it was and the world as it could be. New temporalities, perhaps, were at work here. Poppers allowed dancers to anticipate through pleasure a happier, sexually liberated future, and to bring the future into the body and brain via the rush that poppers allowed. If the personal was political, and if the post-Wolfenden report regime of heteronormativity denied viability and visibility to queer collective belonging and dancing in public, dancing together on drugs could be politics, and the future could be now. In a similar fashion, the undoubted sexual capacities of poppers as a precursor to penetrative sex, as awakeners of desire, as intensifiers of sexual pleasure, spoke to the gay liberation movement's avowal of sex between men and a dissolution of boundaries between bodies as a site of pleasure and possibility. In 1982, the Hardware brand of poppers spoke directly to the erotics of poppers' use through its national Mr. Hardware competition taking place at gay clubs up and down the country. Advertisements in newspapers like London's Capital Gay, vouching for the ability of the distinctive, if not altogether pleasant aroma of poppers to make you hard and to summon the kind of muscle man that the heart desired. Queer sociality and queer sex, poppers circulated in the 70s, I would argue, as technologies of both, as a powerful dose of heart medicine dispensed every night in the spaces of the queer counterpublic, social locations that Lauren Ballant and Michael Warner identify as ones where, quote, forms of affective, erotic and personal living that are collective and accessible to all queer people and beyond the bounds of heteronormativity find precarious expression in public life. I think we can productively think today about the radical challenge to straightness, or at least straightness's perception of itself, that the use of poppers in queer social spaces like pubs and clubs posed in the late 1970s and 80s, when illicit drug use in Britain in general continues to be associated with groups at the fringes of society. And more particularly when the use of poppers has still not crossed over into the heterosexual social scene. We need to think about the rights, the use of poppers and the use of poppers before or during sex claimed to both the body and to particular pockets of urban space where sold and consumed. The distinctive smell of the club, quite like anything else outside, the smell of solvents, but also described or sometimes marketed in the gay press as the smell of the locker room, old socks, overripe bananas. This was a version of olfactory politics that signaled a kind of liberation in the 70s and 80s, new forms of sociality and agency, and the disruptive potential of the conjunction of sex and drugs, or the pharmacosexual. That's kind of a utopian reading in a way of what was going on here, I admit. Another way you could talk about this, I think, would be as part of the history of queer capitalism, or the pink pound, as it's sometimes called in the UK context, because the sale of poppers in areas of London like Soho and in queer pubs and nightclubs is a burgeoning market, I suppose, in the 70s and 80s. So yeah, there's another kind of story, perhaps a less utopian one, arguably, that you could maybe tell here as well. Anyway, I want to return to this notion of the gay pub or club, which hosted discos as a space for sexual counterpublic, existing in a kind of third position between the sexual public and the private sphere, and most obviously the family. So Lauren Ballant and Michael Warner see this sort of the public spaces of sex, the public realm of sex as expressed through law, for example, public law, legislative law, and the family, on the other hand, as the private sphere, is being joined together under heteronormativity through institutions such as marriage. So the Wolfenden Committee, which reported in 1957, took the view, later embedded in the 1967 Sexual Offences Act, that, quote, the law's function is to preserve public order and decency, to protect the citizen from what is offensive or injurious, and to provide sufficient safeguards against exploitation and corruption of others. It is not, wrote Wolfenden, in our view, the function of the law to intervene in the private life of citizens or seek to enforce any particular pattern of behaviour, sexual behaviour. So we see here in Wolfenden's this sort of, in a way, a totemic document of sexual liberalism in post-war Britain, which defines this kind of area of sexual private life beyond the law. Already some conditions here, right, about this being kind of between two consenting adults. By figures like Lord Arran, who said in 1967 that homosexual men on decriminalisation of homosexuality must comport themselves quietly and with dignity. Those were his words. So the Wolfenden Report and the legislation that followed set up a division between the straight sexual public, or if it couldn't be straight, a well-behaved and dignified homosexual public operating on the principle of invisibility, and a sphere of private life which would be left relatively untroubled by the state, so long as it didn't draw attention to itself. So in this context, queer counter-public spaces could continue to exist under the sexual order of the Wolfenden settlement, though the stipulations about two consenting adults in private and others was an obvious point of fragility. And this sexual order became embedded into the city after 1967. From the late 60s, gay pubs continued as part of a queer cultural infrastructure, to use a term of Ben Campkin and Low Marshalls, hidden in plain sight, anchoring, if not replacing, the more fluid queer spaces of the pre-decriminalisation years, such as the cottages and the cruising grounds. Through them, landlords and punters carefully and quietly exercised the provisional right to the city. So the Royal Vauxhall Tavern was one of these pubs, the oldest gay pub in London, and a home of cabaret and drag associated with the famous British drag artist Lily Savage, of dancing, drinking, and in the context of AIDS, charitable work especially. HIV and AIDS from the early 80s definitively problematized the existence of queer counter-public spaces of post-1960s London, and I would argue required their dissolution. The 80s witnessed the development of a new viral politics that constructed men who had sex with men as a threat to public or heterosexual safety. At the same time, it was recognised that a government could not legislate against a disease such as this. And even in the 80s, under a conservative government, a particularly right-wing conservative government, it was also understood, at least by most, that one could not revert back to the days before decriminalisation. Other forms of community protection, not always coordinated, began to emerge. As Matt Cook, the historian, has noted, this viral politics fundamentally undermined the Wolfenden model, predicated as it was on a distinction between a heteronormative public sphere and a limited zone of privacy, which was now recast as a covenant broke by the errant behaviour of men who had sex with men. The deadly, mysterious virus travelled across notional divides of public and private, making the spaces of the queer counter-public immediately suspect and vulnerable. If men who had sex with men were seen as the carriers of disease, the spaces of the sexual counter-public were seen as its site of origin, and intoxication as its affective and physiological mode. The availability of poppers, a technology that seemed to bring together sex, eroticism, and social affect, to bring together bodies in space, was an unsurprising target. So the RVT, the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, was raided by police in December 86 and again in January 87. In the first raid, a few days before Christmas, police from Kennington Station entered during a Lily Savage performance, arresting the landlord and a barman, apparently for selling poppers. A few weeks later, 30 Kennington Station police officers wearing rubber gloves shook down the landlord's customers instead, arresting 11 with being drunk in a pub, drunk on a licensed premises. One of these men, who would later successfully sue the police for his unlawful arrest, said he had only drunk 2 pints of bitter when the police took him in. The RVT's status as a pub rather than a members-only club, which was a route that other queer establishments in London had chosen, made it especially vulnerable to policing. These raids symbolically and dramatically turned the semi-private counter-public space of the gay pub inside out, rendering it now a threat to public safety and a space where public order now needed to be reimposed. As a result of the first raid, the landlord...
2 minutes.
Sorry? Thank you.
2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. As a result of the first raid, the barman Paul Blackburn and 4 suppliers were all charged with conspiracy to administer a noxious substance with intent to injure, namely the sale or manufacture of poppers under Section 24 of the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act concerning poisoning, a novel application of this law in England in a drugs case. After the second law, this rubber-gloved raid, no charges were brought. This was just a shakedown in the end. I'm running out of time, and I sort of probably planned my timing slightly badly, but all of this raid, which eventually led to all charges being dropped, although it was highly symbolic of Thatcherite sexual politics, I would argue, was fundamentally tied up, I think, with this kind of clash between a sort of what the theorist Lee Edelman would call a sort of straight reproductive futurism on the part of the government and the police, arguably concerned with kind of family values and heterosexual reproductive monogamy on the one hand, and these kind of new sort of future-oriented socialities and sexualities of the kind I described earlier, in which poppers were seen as opening up. And all of this kind of came to a head in the right-wing press just in the run-up to this raid on the Vauxhall Tavern, arguably leading to this raid on the Vauxhall Tavern, where these events essentially were sort of staged by the Daily Telegraph newspaper of children trying to buy poppers. You can see here on the slide a photograph from this newspaper article, trying to buy poppers from the Royal Vauxhall Tavern as a gay pub. So it kind of fears really about sort of the safety and sanctity of childhood and children's sexuality in the context of kind of aberrant queer social and sexual practices in the context of this new virus. So lots of kind of interesting things, I think, going on here. But as I said, eventually the trial led to nothing. But nonetheless, this kind of left a scar in a way on the sort of, especially the social landscape of late 80s queer spaces in London, eventually led to kind of more rigorous forms of licensing and policing and so on. So I will leave it there, and thanks to Anne, and apologies I ran slightly out of time.